and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 73. Bringing on an author and talking with them in detail about one, occasionally more, of their books. I'm Charlie Place, and today I am joined by Orlando Ortega-Medina, who I spoke to in episode 2. He's the author of The Death of Baseball, The Saviour of 6th Street, and the short story collection Jerusalem Ablaze. We'll be talking today about his latest novel, The Fitful Sleep of Immigrants, which looks at the personal journey of a gay lawyer in the late 90s whose hard-won happy life comes under threat from a number of sources. He's got an anti-LGBT client, another client who's obsessed with him, a history of love and loss he's struggling with, and now, to add to the mix, his long-term partner Issac is looking at a potential deportation. So that's enough from me. Hello, Orlando. How are you?
Hi, Charlie. How are you?
I'm very well. You?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Thank you. I'm speaking to you today from sunny California, so very happy to be here.
I had wondered, because you turned up and you look quite summery, and it's certainly more summery than it is over here at the moment, yeah. I've been looking at our other episode, making sure we don't cover the same content. We didn't cover this last time, so I believe it's kind of relevant here, especially with the book. Can I ask you about your career as a lawyer, and also you have your own company? Could you tell us all about it?
When I first graduated from law school, I practiced criminal defense under a fairly well-known criminal defense lawyer here in Los Angeles. I did that for a number of years, and then I went off on my own. I didn't really like the practice of criminal defense that much. I didn't really have the stomach for it, but it was what I had been trained to do from the very beginning, and so I went with that. But eventually, I relocated from Los Angeles to San Francisco with my partner, and I segued into defending individuals who'd been accused of crimes, but who were being placed into deportation. I was representing them in immigration court, and I liked that better than the criminal defense itself. And then when I eventually left San Francisco, I went to Canada and then the UK and reinvented myself as a purely immigration lawyer with no connection to criminal defense or deportation defense. We just focused on visas. So that's been the arc of my professional journey.
So immigration law, it's a subject close to your heart.
It is, yes. It is for two reasons. One is I enjoy the practice of immigration law, but also because my own personal life, in a sense, was a failure of the immigration system. I wasn't able to find a way to keep my partner, who happened to be a foreign national living in the United States, because he and I were of the same gender. We weren't allowed to marry, and I wasn't allowed to sponsor him. So therefore, we sought joint status elsewhere, someplace where we could both have the same residency, the same nationality, and that was outside of the United States. So it is ironic that I came back to immigration as a practice, helping people get into the United States. And even maybe a little bit more ironic is because the United States does allow immigration based on same-sex marriage these days, then I'm helping people who are same-sex couples, Americans marrying foreign nationals, to emigrate the foreign national to the States these days. So that's sort of the height of the irony that I had to leave in order to be able to find that part of my professional career.
Now, you know the system, so you know how to do it.
Exactly, yes.
I've got other questions sort of on this thing here, but I'm going to just ask one thing. You said for Authority magazine, and I'll link that for people who are listening, that if you knew when you were younger that being a lawyer couldn't be done part-time so that you'd be able to write part-time as well, you'd have done things differently. And I'm wondering, back then, obviously this is before your lawyer work effectively, what changes you might have made to your plan?
What I've learned is that there is a way to fit writing in even when one has a full-time job. And I didn't really appreciate that at the time. I thought it was either or. Well, my first mistake or a misbelief was that I could find a job as a lawyer part-time. So say working half-time and making enough to make a living. And then the other half of the time I would be able to write, but I was never able to find that job. So I ended up working full-time as a lawyer and couldn't quite find the time to write at the beginning part of my career. But since then, I did discover that if I got up early enough, a couple of hours before actually needing to get ready for work, then I would have a good enough time to be able to incorporate writing into my life. So that's what I would have done differently. Is I still would have gone in the career path of becoming a lawyer, but I would have known how to incorporate writing from the very beginning. I wouldn't have let it go like I did. I ended up letting it go for a good 10 years before I came back to it.
That's interesting to hear, particularly today for me, because I got up early and thought I would do some writing and I couldn't. So yeah, I have to admire you being able to do that. I have to have my breakfast and stuff before I even think about it. Yeah. So we'll move on kind of to the book itself. Mark's family, this is the main character, has a long history of immigrating, and we've touched on yours. Could I ask you how you went about writing Mark's journey and this story in the context of what you knew, out of that context, etc., just how you came to write his book?
So in many respects, Mark is me. And in many respects, the journey of Mark's family tracks the journey of my family. Not exactly. I had Mark's family originating as of late out of Syria by way of Cuba and then into the United States. And in my particular family, we came by way of Spain, Cuba, the United States. So that was a little bit different. And that was based on some friends I have who are actually Syrian Cuban Jews. So I found that quite fascinating, that whole journey of theirs. So I merged or meshed up their family journey with my family journey. Now, in terms of Mark himself, as I was imagining him and before I actually approached the writing of the book, I wrote extensive biographies about Mark, and I did a family tree, as I tend to do with a lot of my characters. I did a family tree about his grandparents, about his parents, where they were born, when they emigrated, what was their ultimate fate. And then I wrote character studies for Mark. So that's how I approached Mark and the other characters as well. I wrote biographies for all of them, but Mark is the one who I really delved the deepest in because he is, after all, the narrator of the story, and it's his story.
That's fascinating to hear. I know that I really appreciated, I suppose appreciated is the word, how you've got all of the characters, but Issac in particular. I can understand why the story is not from his perspective. I suppose you need the drama that Mark brings. But it was interesting that what you say about the family tree, because the other thing that I thought with the characters is how well drawn the parents are. They are wonderful. Can I ask you about how you went about creating the parents, if there's any inspirations and stuff like that?
Yes. So Mark's father is a rabbi. My father is not a rabbi. But aside from that small detail, Mark's parents in many ways are similar to my own parents. Mark's father is very similar to my father. We had similar conversations as I was going through my own personal journey. My mother is very similar to Mark's mother. So it was patterned very much, again, on my family. Mark's twin brother, is somewhat patterned on my own brother. We're not twins. Mark and his brother are twins, but my brother and I, we may look like twins, but we're not. So again, I would say that I like to describe this as an alternate universe version of my own life story. So there are many similarities, but there are also many differences. And that's the interesting bit for people to sort of pick through, especially people who know me personally, to sort of pick through and see which are the bits that are actually really me and which are the parts that are fictionalized.
There's me wondering then how we would approach this interview with knowing what I do know about you and also with what I've read about you. I'll go back to Issac, and I want to look at the political situation in El Salvador, if that's okay. Could you give us a brief idea, I suppose, in the context of Issac's life and what he's experienced, but also just the general picture? Could you tell us what was going on?
Well, when Issac was first born, there was no civil war. Everything was seemingly okay, but the country was actually, in fact, in the hands of a fairly right-wing military junta and that sort of thing. So there was stability, but it was enforced stability. And then the country, similar to what happened in Cuba, there was a left-wing rebellion against the government, which turned into a civil war. That civil war in El Salvador, I believe it lasted around 12 years. And Issac's family suffered casualties during that civil war, including his brother at the hand of what appeared to be the military, the government's army. So Issac's family his mother specifically, decide to send him away from El Salvador to the safety of the United States. So he has his own story, obviously. And I think that's something that I will tell at some point, perhaps in a prequel. But Isaac makes a journey from El Salvador through Guatemala, through Mexico, and into the United States. This is a journey that many people are still making. However, today, the Civil War is over, and there is stability in El Salvador now. It's gone through a lot of things, including a lot of gang violence and all, but it seems to have reached a point of some stability these days. Now, the important point on Isaac is that when he entered the United States had a program called temporary protected status. They still have it. It's not full asylum, it's temporary asylum. It gives the right to a person who enters the United States the right to live and work in the United States on the condition that once the country conditions change and become safe, then those people have to go back home. And usually the process by which they go back home is that they're giving a deportation hearing, and then they're allowed to present whatever evidence they have as to why the judge should not return them back to their home country.
Something you said about the deportations there, it's very noticeable and very frustrating, but well done literarily, I suppose you could say. The person who is prosecuting at the immigration deportation court hearing just keeps on coming up with these horrible objections, and it's really quite nasty. I mean, you've said about the temporary visa, effectively, that people get, and then Isaac has been considering this deportation that might happen. These objections, did these kind of things happen? Because it felt, at least to me as a reader, quite sudden and almost shocking the way that this prosecution was behaving.
That's very typical of the way that they go about their job. Yes, I mean, it literally is an advocacy game in court, whether we're talking about immigration court or criminal court or even civil court. That's the U.S. system. It's not considered to be necessarily a fair system. It's not that people they're literally in a sparring match between each other. The lawyer that's representing the immigration service is trying their hardest to find any way for the judge to decide in their favor, i.e. deportation. And the defense lawyer is doing everything that they can, regardless of what they know or don't know about the person, to win their case as well. So they try to present as much evidence in favor of the respondent in this case. And then the judge, it's a third personality there, to be honest. You hope for a judge who's going to be impartial. That's their role, is impartiality. But some judges are not entirely impartial. Some of them bring their own stuff to the table, and that's quite frustrating. That's what leads eventually, potentially, to appeals if one loses and one wants to go through the whole process and the expense of appealing a case like this.
The deportation happens effectively, so we understand, because things happen with a character who we'll get into in a minute. Mark and Isaac, or Isaac particularly, can't rely on the fact that he's in a same-sex relationship. He can't use that to help him in the court. Would they have been able to successfully have done that if it hadn't been for this other character?
I hope this wouldn't be considered to be a spoiler, but I think that in the context of this particular hearing and this particular judge, I don't think that they would have succeeded. You may remember the comments that the judge makes at the end, sort of out of his own volition. There are other judges that may have viewed this. Bear in mind that the judges have full discretion when it comes to this. If they had appeared before a judge who felt sympathetic to the facts and decided to make a decision based on more of a humanitarian basis rather than in the law, they could have decided in favor of Isaac. And the way it works is that usually in cases like that, the other side, the immigration lawyer side, will not usually appeal a decision that goes against them. They'll usually accede. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes if they really feel strongly that a judge has made an incorrect decision against them, then they will appeal. But again, you never know. So I think that going into this whole process, the lawyer that represented Isaac had some hopes that they might be able to prevail.
Yeah, she was fabulous, and she suggested that the judge might be okay. He knew her, and it kind of gives you that feeling that it's going to work out. So let's get on to that character that I mentioned. Alejandro Silva, he will not go away. Oh my goodness. Why can he not just go away? But he's absolutely crucial to the text. I've literally just said that, but I'm now going to ask, can you just tell us all about him, his role, the importance of his character effectively to the book for you, etc.?
So Alejandro Silva is a U.S.-born person of Mexican ancestry. He's born to a teenage mother out of wedlock. She is very much under the thrall of her father, who was a very tyrannical sort of character who decides to punish her, his daughter, by sending her and his grandchild, Alejandro Silva, to Mexico, effectively for Alejandro to be raised over there with other family members who can keep an eye on Alejandro's mother. So this, obviously has some devastating consequences on Alejandro's mental health. Eventually, his grandfather calls Alejandro back at the age of 16-ish, 15, 16, to finish the education of Alejandro in a private boys' school. And he also puts him in a way to makes almost a slave of him in his own businesses in San Diego. This is in the southern part of California, far away from San Francisco. But the guy is quite damaged. He was quite damaged as an individual. He's very starved for affection, starved for male affection in particular, and affection from older men, because his grandfather, again, the tyrannical person that he was psychologically abusive to him, provided for him, but never ever gave him any kind of affection. So Alejandro, all of this background, unbeknownst to Mark, shows up at Mark's law firm. Now, the critical thing here is that Alejandro Silva bears a striking resemblance to Mark's first love in his life, which is a person named Simon, who died tragically under tragic circumstances that Mark was involved in. So when Mark first lays eyes on Alejandro Silva and starts to represent him and all, he's sort of under the radar, maybe even under his own radar, becoming attracted to Alejandro Silva. And Alejandro Silva, also maybe under the radar, is also becoming similarly attracted to Mark. But at the start of the story, it's still just a purely professional relationship. And that's how the story begins. All of the threads of the story are very tightly spun together. So it's really difficult to talk about, say, a secondary storyline or what have you, because in a way, if you start to pick at one, the entire novel depends on the different strands. I'm sure you have some follow-up questions on that.
I mean, I do. I'll say first that you pointed out all the parts of the story are interlinked. I struggled to work out what was most important, even though I was thinking, well, immigration, it's the title, it's a big part of it. But no, I did want to ask something about Alejandro. Given everything that happens and how, he doesn't go away and he does keep causing harm, really, especially to the relationship between Mark and Issac, should we feel sorry for him at all?
Maybe a bit. He sees himself as a victim, and I think he is a victim. And I think that victimization of Alejandro Silva as a young person caused him to become the person that he is today. Now, the person that he is today, it's interesting because, he's a charmer, but he sees something in Mark that I think he has never really seen in somebody before, which is, here's a person that maybe is going to be the person that I've been looking for my whole life. He's an older guy, he's a smart guy, he's not too old. He's like close to my age, but he's successful. And he's obviously attracted to me as well. This is Alejandro thinking. He's attracted to me. I can tell by the way he looks at me. I can tell by the way he talks to me. I think this is the guy that I want. And he does start to pursue Mark. I would say sort of a genuine wooing of Mark, not knowing that Mark is already in a relationship, because that's a fact that Mark himself holds back. And I would say in that case, the reader should probably be questioning Mark's judgment as to, why are you not telling this guy that you're in a relationship, that you're a gay man, you're in a relationship? Why are you not telling this guy who's obviously interested in you? So by the time Alejandro Silva finds out that Mark actually is in a relationship, then it's like he's already he's already fallen for Mark. And he's thinking the only thing that's keeping me from being able to be with Mark is this relationship that he has. So that's why he doesn't go away. He's looking for the way to get Issac out of the way so that he can then move in on Issac's territory and get together with Mark. Realistic or irrealistic as it may actually be, that's what's driving Alejandro.
And Issac, I mean, he's a great character, but you can tell he is just so well matched to Mark, or at least you hope Mark realizes that and he comes to. But he puts up with a lot. And I suppose I just want to say how amazing Issac is. And yeah, you've got Mark as the main character. We're focused on him, but Issac is always in the background. And I think particularly when you're reading about it, you're always thinking about Issac and how Isaac's going to feel. More so, I think, in a way than Mark half the time. Alejandro, talking about him a little bit more, and you've mentioned Simon. And Simon is quite like Alejandro physically, and Mark is still traumatized by what's happened. I suppose I want to say, is there anything in the similarity, I suppose, between Simon and Alejandro's deaths, that they died because, in quotes, of Mark?
I don't think that it was something that it was a conscious choice that I made. I think that it just developed that way. And I do have a tendency, I've noticed looking back even at my other works, to always sort of bring back a parallel from a backstory into the front story. So there are always parallels that are running between different characters. The book went through several revisions, to be honest. The first version of the book, the first fiction version of the book, is quite different, especially as regards the characters of both Alejandro and Issac, as compared to what the final product was. So one of the things that developed later in the process was this whole parallel between Alejandro and Simon. And also the parallel, again, about Mark feeling responsible for the death of Simon. And then now he projects this feeling responsible for the death of Alejandro onto himself as well. So again, it was not something that was plotted from the beginning. It's just something that worked out as I was in the editing phase and making connections between different parts of the book. They're little surprises that I plant there for the reader to either pick up on or not pick up on. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think you're the first person to actually perceive that connection, which I had sort of planted in there towards the end of the process.
Well, it's interesting that you said, as you just said, you plant it in the end of the process, because I thought that particularly had to have been there from the start. It was just so well done, and you've tied it all up together. And yeah, that's really interesting. You have said there, you said the fiction version of this book. There was a non-fiction version or a memoir version of this book?
There was a memoir version of the book. That's what I started working on at the beginning when I first left the United States. I thought, I've got to tell my story. So I just started working, and I was very obsessive about the whole thing. And I was writing, as I've mentioned in a couple of other interviews, I was writing from a position of being bitter and angry, actually. So what was coming out was not good. I mean, both from a writing perspective, because again, it was an early draft anyway, it was not going to be that great. But also I noticed that it was just it was not something that was pleasant to read. Mark was coming across as very angry, very bitter person, even sort of in the early days before he knew what was coming. And I did complete it, actually. I went from beginning to end. And then I just said, this is not working. And I had a beta reader look at it, and they said, I don't know about these characters. They're not very likable at all, especially Mark. He's a horrible person. I was like, no, he just feels horrible. He's not horrible. So then I just put it away. And then it was always in the back of my mind as I was working on other things that I was going to come back to it at some point. After I had the experience of having successfully written 2 other novels, I thought, now that I have sort of gotten my novel chops, I'm going to pull this out, this memoir out, and I'm just going to turn it into a novel. And at that point, there was no Simon at all. There was no Simon in the story whatsoever, but there was a Simon in previous books that I had written. I had talked about Simon in Jerusalem Ablaze, and I also talked about Simon in The Death of Baseball. And also Mark was also in the Death of Baseball and Jerusalem Ablaze as well. So these characters were floating out there, and I brought them together into this fiction that I made out of the memoir that I had originally penned.
May I ask, I mean, you've written this book now and you planned a memoir, but do you think you might get to a point at some point where you might want to write your memoir as your memoir?
I might. I'm reading a lot of memoirs these days. They seem to be quite the thing. So I may do that. But I think that there's still some fictional ground that I need to cover. I do want to do Isaac's story. I think that we need to know about things from his perspective. And also there's a story, a fiction, maybe a memoir, I don't know, on their experience in Canada once they arrived in Canada. But right now, what I'm actively working on is pre-planning Isaac's story about his experiences in El Salvador and actually his journey through Guatemala and Mexico as a kind of Wizard of Oz-ish type of journey to the Emerald City, which is the United States, supposedly.
I look forward to that. That's going to be interesting to read. Definitely more Issac, even if it's difficult to read. I would like to ask about one of the things that kind of kicks off Mark spiraling almost. You've got this St. Cloud or Sun Cloud case where these three women come to Mark's office and he is already known for his work effectively promoting the rights of gay people, and now he's got this case where women are wanting to prosecute the company they were working for because they believed they were let go of in favour of gay employees, and this is obviously causing a problem for Mark. Is this based on a real case at all? Are there any cases that inspired you for this?
There were cases like that in San Francisco at the time that I was working there. So there was more than one case where people were like, oh, well, if it works this way, then it should work the other way as well. And I think that Mark saw himself as not just a lawyer, not just a hired gun, the way that his partner saw them. You know, we're here to defend anybody who's been discriminated in the workplace, regardless of who or what they are. And Mark had come to see himself and the firm as being, no, we're here to defend the rights of gay and lesbians against discrimination in the workplace. So I don't think that we should be seen as a firm that would take a case of heterosexual people who are being discriminated against by LGBT people. So that this is where he starts to have the really big disagreements with his boss.
Mm-hmm. I was willing to see where it would go, and I'll kind of hold back any judgment on them. And I love that you didn't even have to say anything outright. I mean, obviously you do through the women, but the women's own personality just showed what the reality was. Do you think there's a chance, particularly as many say after abortion rights have been overturned, as they have been recently, that same-sex marriage rights might be rescinded in the US?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think, well, when it comes to the Supreme Court of the United States, one of the good things about them is that they are appointed for life. So supposedly they're meant to be non-political, even though the appointment process is a political process. They are appointed for life. So that's supposed to remove any political influence from their decision-making process. And also it gives a certain stability to the court. You know, that these people are the ones who are going to be interpreting the Constitution for a generation or what have you. Problem is that because it is a political appointment and because it is so long, if you have, say, a particularly conservative government that gets an opportunity to stack the retiring judges with people who are very conservative, then it's almost guaranteed that they're going to start to look back at the Constitution in reference to cases that are brought before them and start to interpret things from a more conservative point of view, which is exactly what happened with Roe versus Wade. We had a generation of people feeling that abortion rights were settled. You know, this is not an argument anymore. This is something that women now have the right to choose what happens with their bodies. And then now that was all thrown up at this court. And this is the same court that when a case comes to them eventually with regards to same-sex marriage, they could, certainly from the federal perspective, which is the most important part for the immigration perspective, they could certainly invalidate not necessarily the marriages themselves, but the benefit that a person can get from that marriage if it's a same-sex marriage. So they could start to whittle away at those rights at that point. I mean, I'm so happy and thankful after having left the United States and found the stability of, first Canada and then the UK in that respect, where my sexuality and my relationship with my partner are really, for all intents and purposes, non-issues. It's such a liberating feeling. And the idea of, well, now I could sponsor my partner, now husband, for a green card to the United States, and we could go back to the United States. I just don't want to live in a situation where that our status is potentially under threat. 50% of the population sees us as being counterculture or weird, sinful, or whatever it is that term they want to use. To answer your question, yes, I do believe it could happen. And that's from the perspective of a lawyer who knows how the legal system works in the States. And because of that, whilst I'm happy to say I'm a proud American expat, I don't think I would ever go back to live in the United States on any kind of permanent basis because of that.
No, it's kind of damaged its reputation with you effectively.
Yes, exactly, which is sad because, my parents sought a certain also freedom in the United States from what was happening in Cuba. And as far as they were concerned, that was it. That's sort of the last stop. So I think it was shocking to them as well when I decided to leave for, effectively similar reasons to theirs, although, different but similar reasons. So yeah, it did damage its reputation with me, but it's still home. At least, it's where my family is. It's where my friends are, where I went to school, and I love our annual visits to the States. But again, home for us is the UK, and that's where we expect to live out our days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Cross our fingers that the UK stays like that. Obviously, see things happening. Hope it won't come over here and all that. Yeah, completely different topic entirely. There is a wonderful, wonderful passage in the book where Mark has just told his father about how the darkness in his life has a big impact. And his father talks about how things can be beautiful because of their darkness, that it's the darkness that lets us see the light, and that you need both dark and light to appreciate the beauty of the view that they are seeing, which is the city at night from the Golden Gate Bridge. I highlighted this section because I thought it was lovely and important. Was it an important part of the book for you to write?
It was a very important part of the book, yes. It was a late addition to the book. This was during COVID. I'm Jewish and I practice Judaism, but we weren't allowed to go to synagogues or to Torah studies or anything of that nature in person, as we were all locked down in the UK. So there's a particular rabbi, I really like him. He's an intellectual giant and he's an inspiration. And so my partner and I every Thursday, we would listen in on his studies and his philosophizing about life and about Judaism. And there was one particular episode, I can say, or one particular study that he did, where he went into this whole thing about the dark and the light, and about how you need to, in order to be a mature person, you have to be able to turn down the darkness, turn up the light in just the right balance in order to be a mature person. And those of us who are maybe less mature, it's because we haven't learned to balance the dark and the light. So I was so struck by that. And I thought, I have to find some way to get that into the book. So then I got to this scene where Mark and his father are on the Golden Gate Bridge at night. And I thought, that's it. This is the opportunity. You're looking at the lights of the city. You can't see the lights of the city unless it's dark and the lights are on. You have to have both of those things, because if the lights were off, it's just dark. If it's just the daytime and all you see is the city, you don't actually get to see that beauty of the lights on the buildings and all. So that was my chance to get that in there.
That is a point where Mark has another change again.
Yes.
Which is lovely as well. Yeah. So in the literal, the figurative, yes, etc. So I'm going to try and pronounce it right then, as per your pronunciation. Mitzpe Ramon.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. I noticed this particularly because I think you used it in The Death of Baseball as well. You had the town there. I want to say you've used it in Jerusalem Ablaze, potentially, I think. Is it an important place for you?
Yeah, it is an important place. It's I can't tell you what exactly is the reason for that, but when I was 18, I spent a year in Israel, and that's one of the places that I went to. And so there's a desert in southern Israel called the Negev. And the Negev desert has two parts to it. It's got upper Negev and it's got lower Negev. And then what divides Upper Negev and Lower Negev is a canyon, in effect. And the town that's at the lip of that canyon, it's Mitzpe Ramon. So it's very much for me this place that's in the middle of nowhere. And especially when I was 18, it literally was in the middle of nowhere. It's this outpost that used to be a clay mining town. And lots of bad things have happened in Mitzpe Ramon. But also, I like to think that it's a place of transition. It's a place where you can go out and be in the middle of nowhere and connect with this desert experience. But you have to be very careful because it might come to bite you. So it's become a metaphor for me that I've come back to repeatedly. Yes, in Jerusalem Ablaze, in the short story Jerusalem Ablaze, it makes an appearance. And also in The Death of Baseball, it makes a significant appearance. And again here. And in fact, there is a specific location in the canyon of Mitzpe Ramon that is the same exact setting where something in Death of Baseball happens. It's exactly the same place where Mark and Simon have their final scene. It's in that exact location.
I think you've given me a deeper appreciation of the stargazing and putting it all together. Orlando, this has been wonderful. Thank you for coming back, and so looking forward to this next book. Absolutely. Bring it on. Love to read it.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, and thank you also for reading the book. I always love to hear what people think about what I've written. I mean, I write for people to read, so I'm happy to know that you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for listening. Please do share this episode with anyone you think would be interested in it. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 73, was recorded on the 6th of April and published on the 24th of April, 2023. Music and production by Charlie Place.